This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on National Monetization Pipeline. The participants are Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, Economic Analyst, and Nilab Srivastav, Journalist.
Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced a rupees 6 lakh crore National Monetization Pipeline, NMP, and this aims looking at unlocking the value of infrastructure assets across the sectors. And this was also in collaboration with the Niti Aayog. And this is basically a result of the finance minister's budget that was in this February this year. And this particular agenda of the assets monetization pipeline is that there can be an economic growth through private sector partnership, creation of new assets through monetization. And as if I can use the quotes of the Niti Aayog CEO, Mr. Amitabh Kant, and the finance minister herself, that this is going to unlock the value of the government money in these brownfield assets that are there. Mr. Bhattacharjee, what is the framework of this NMP or entire National Assets Monetization Pipeline, and what are the sectors that are going to be included in this?
The Government of India holds lots of assets. Now, when we say by assets, what do we mean? A simple example. In Delhi, there are several government colonies that the government runs. Now, these government colonies have been built by the government at government money, and they have now been allowed to be used for several work. For instance, government employees stay there, or there can be a government office, so on and so forth. These are assets of the government, standing on land which is also owned by the government. What the National Asset Monetization Pipeline aims to do across India is to say that the government has total ownership of these assets. These assets will now be leased out to entities which are interested in managing it. So, for instance, a government colony can be leased out to a private company, a private real estate company, any other company of that sort. That company will run this asset for the next 25, 30, 40 years. At the end of the 40 years, it will hand over that asset back to the government. So first of all, the government is not selling the asset. But then what is the interest of the private sector company? The private sector company, when it gets this asset, creates, for instance, several apartments. And it can then use those apartments to be rented out. Or it can create offices. Or it can do a combination of both. All of those will be under its management for the next 30 years. During those 30 years, that asset, whatever the returns that come, for instance, by renting out the apartment or by leasing out the offices to companies, whoever wants to run offices from there, and there'll be lots obviously, will come to the private sector company. So essentially what's happening is here that the private sector company is investing its money to run the government asset, run it for a specified number of years, earn a return, and after the period is over, hand it over back to the government. This is the crux of the National Asset Monetization Program. The word that he used, brownfield, means exactly that there is no new land parcels being created. There is no new property which the government is saying that you come along and do work here. These are all assets that the government already owns. For instance, a port or an airport or a railway line. The government is saying you run it, earn profit from it under the regulations, and then hand it back to the government after a specified number of years.
One important point which the finance minister also stressed because of certain reports that were there in the media, and there were concerns that the ownership of the assets remain with the government and there is a mandatory handback clause also. Now going forward, I was listening to the press conference that was held this evening by the finance minister and the Niti Aayog senior officials and other secretaries of other departments. Now, 2-3 words, Mr. Bhattacharjee, I would want to bring in context for the benefit of our listeners are when the government says that this is going to be rolled out in a very specified fashion. Now, there are contractual partnerships which will have full KPIs and performance standards, and also there's going to be a hand-holding provision here. And also one of the important points which the FM, the finance minister and others also said is that everything is going to unlock the resources in a very suitable manner. So how do you understand this contractual partnership and the performance standard?
So the first part is clear that we have said that the asset will never be sold to anyone. It will stay with the government. That has been cleared out. The second part, which is that on what terms does the government give it to the private sector? This is what is meant by the contractual arrangements, the KPI, which is that under the performance related norms. So for instance, supposing a port has been given to a private sector company. Now what will happen is the contract will have to say, and this is where the smartness of the contracts will come in, that what is it that the port is supposed to be used for? For instance, how many berths are supposed to be created? Will that be something written there? No. But for instance, how much of shipping does that port expect to generate? What is the revenue share mechanism that will be there with the port and the government, with the private sector company and the government? What will be the additional investment that will be created by the private sector company? So these are for different sort of, as you can see, for the different sort of assets, there'll be different sort of benchmarks. Obviously, since the private sector company will be running it, there will be something will have to be left on the table for the private sector to earn profit. That is given. But beyond that, what happens is, since these assets are not something which has to be built from scratch, in the sense that the issues about landholding, issues about environment, issues about clearances, those have already been settled in these assets because they are already functional assets. The private sector company can start work on them immediately and therefore generate returns faster. So the contract that is written between the government and the private sector companies will be interesting. For instance, to take an example, already there are several roads which have been given to the private sector. Now what does it say? That there will be certain returns from that road project. That returns will go to the private sector company, and in exchange for that, the company will maintain that road. So there will be, the contract will say that the road, for instance, if it's a 4-lane road or a 6-lane road, the road has to be maintained in such and such condition. Certain amount of it should be comfortable enough, certain level of traffic to travel through that road. That's already happening. Similarly for, say, thermal plants, power plants, that so much of production has to happen. These are the sort of things that will be written out there.
If I exactly understood you, the assets here are right on the launch pad, ready for takeoff. One of the important points also mentioned by the finance minister was about the NMP, or the National Assets Monetization Pipeline, now running co-terminus with the National Infrastructure Pipeline. This was, if I'm correct, was declared in December 2019.
That's right.
Please elaborate on this, Mr. Bhattacharjee.
So the National Infrastructure Pipeline, these are, very big numbers. So let's try to see what is the National Infrastructure Pipeline saying. The National Infrastructure Pipeline is saying that there will be 100 lakh crores of investment and more. In fact, to be precise, it's 116 lakh crore of investment to be made under the National Infrastructure Pipeline. The National Asset Monetization Pipeline is a subsection of that National Infrastructure Pipeline. So there'll be lots of other stuff that will be done under the infrastructure pipeline. Within that, whatever the government holds in terms of assets, which is basically running units, as I said, ports, airports, railway lines and others, whose value is much lower, they will also be part of the National Infrastructure Pipeline. And as the presentation today said, the expectation is it will be about 6 lakh crore. So we are talking of National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is 116 lakh crore, of which the National Asset Monetization Pipeline will be about 6 to, at best, 8 lakh crore.
What is the role of the Niti Aayog in this? If I remember correctly, what Mr. Amitabh Kant said was that the Niti Aayog has developed kind of parameters and is looking at the kind of development and the progress of this project. And also he mentioned about that there are different ministries, as you already mentioned, rails, roadways and various infrastructure sectors. So there are different ministries. Everyone has a target and there is some dashboard that goes on ticking, and there is this hand-holding thing also comes into play. So what exactly is the kind of Niti Aayog role in this entire project, Mr. Bhattacharjee?
Let's put it this way. When anybody is being asked to invest in something, the private sector, one of the things that a private sector, and that's not just peculiar to India, anywhere in the world, one of the things that they want is project certainty, regulatory certainty. And unfortunately in India, which our ease of doing business ranking has also showed, that contract enforcement has not been one of our strong points. In fact, we are one of the weakest in the world in terms of contract enforcement. Though it must also be accepted that the world's largest number of PPP projects also run in India. But there's definitely a weakness in contract enforcement. The role of Niti Aayog comes in to work out a common or a coherent set of contracts across all ministries. So that if supposing a project, an asset is being given out from the Ministry of Ports and Shipping, it should roughly be similar to what is being offered in the airports, or it should roughly be similar to what is being offered for the railways. Why is it necessary? Because the more the variation that you create, the more the room for court cases, the more the room for errors, the more the room for smart guys to create problems for the government. Essentially, the standardized, the simpler the systems, the easier it is for the courts to monitor, for the regulators to monitor, and for the people for whom these are being talked about, for the people to understand, which is why the dashboard comes in useful, so that any Indian is able to take a look at the dashboard, and it's like we're taking an entire bird's eye view of all the assets that are being monetized, and to get a same picture. It should not be that from different windows you get a different perspective. It should be a common perspective, and this is where again Niti Aayog's role comes in. As I said, the idea is that there should be a uniform, as far as possible, system of contracts for which projects are monetized, how they are run, and how they are returned to the government. It makes it easier for everybody, it's simpler for people, and it makes it coherent for people to understand and have faith that their money, their assets are being taken care of for their best interest.
I want to draw your attention towards one of the important points that the FM said, Nirmala Sitharaman said. And if I can quote her, she says that the end objective of this initiative, the NMP initiative, is to enable infrastructure creation through monetization, wherein the public and private sector collaborate, as you already mentioned, and each excelling in their core areas of competence so as to deliver the socio-economic growth and quality of life to the country. So my question to you, Mr. Bhattacharjee, is this also keeping in mind the COVID-battered economy of the country, and also does this address the issue of job creation and employment generation?
See, any capital creation, as all reports across the world are showing, is the best way to come out of the mess that has been created by COVID. And the best means of capital creation at this time is government-led capital creation. Private sector by its own across the world is not, for various reasons, not very keen to do capital creation, not very keen to take risks even more, even though there's a lot of money sloshing around in the world economy. The best economic returns are coming from those places where government is taking the lead in stepping ahead and then giving the chance to the private sector to follow in footsteps. This doesn't immediately result in job creation, but it results in a lot of job creation subsequently. So, because you're not talking about somebody who has lost his job to be immediately employed here. But what it does is, as we said earlier on and as we discussed, these are projects which can be monetized very fast. So the private sector also, when it takes over these assets, it can start recruiting, it can start making plans very fast. So in the medium term, yes, it leads to a lot of what we call quality jobs for people who are coming out of engineering colleges, from technical institutes, from lots of places who would otherwise not get jobs and would have had to wait for long years for the projects to materialize. So there's definitely far more possibilities of job creation in the medium term under this sort of a project coming out of a world where COVID has left its strong mark on the economies.
I would want you to answer last two questions. One is the NMP is envisaged to have a 4-year cycle now. This is a target for 4 years. So what is the year-wise target and also the overall target? And the second part of the question remains that what is the role of the states? Can the state PSUs or the state entities as such be a part of the NMP?
As the Vice Chairman Niti Aayog pointed out, that this year's target is something like 80,000 crore. And overall, every year, it's about 1,50,000. Why is it 80,000 crore this year? Because we are already into September. So obviously, there's lesser time left for the projects to come for this year. About the states, see, ultimately, central government is just a summation of all the states. I mean, the projects stand in the states. So these projects will obviously benefit, wherever these projects are, they will benefit the respective states. Whether the money goes to the central government or the state government is for the respective political parties and others to understand. But the benefits rebound to the state population. The projects are not standing in isolation anywhere in India where there's no state. So it is obviously something which the states have very big stake on. Regarding whether the state level PSUs can also be monetized in the same way or the state level assets, well, I would say that this is a promising beginning and there is a lot of possibilities. In fact, some of the states, especially in Western India, have already started doing projects on the same lines. So there is evidence based on the experience. I'm sure they'll be able to go ahead forward, and this will be a very good model book or role book for them to pick up in the years ahead.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Mr. Bhattacharjee.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on National Monetization Pipeline. The participants were Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, Economic Analyst, and Neelab Srivastav, Journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio.